It's not in the face! Thank you.
Welcome for today's episode of Hey Not the Face. There's no Crooklyn doing it solo, so it's going to be a train wreck, as you know from all my previous ones. But we have a very special guest today. The one and only Luke Mother Effin Thomas is here. Perhaps, maybe not the biggest guy in combat sports, but in the upper echelon of the biggest guys in combat sports. And now, since this show, we cover the business side of combat sports, you'd expect us to discuss that, and we will. But I have a feeling, Luke, me and you would agree on way too much. So I've been kind of searching for questions we would not agree on, because I think a lot of our views on combat sports are very similar. So I am going to try to focus on stuff we won't agree on, or maybe we won't agree, but at least we haven't discussed before that other people have not discussed, new subjects.
Okay.
And I'll get a little bit on your politics shit, because Crooklyn keeps bugging me about talking politics, and I really do not care to talk about on the show, but with you here, why not? Bring it up. That's your...
We can keep it narrowly defined and therefore make it a little more palatable.
We are going to go into my favorite politics. Compassionate fascism is what I follow, and so I think that'll be... I'm going to try to espouse that today and defend it, but we will get to that later. So let's get into some of the UFC politics, the UFC far right connection, which you've talked a lot about. That I think a lot of people have got a lot of blowback because of that, which I always find shocking because it seems pretty obvious to me that the UFC has made this decision. But one thing people don't, I guess, discuss a little bit, but haven't delved into, we viewed Trump and Dana White as friends, and that's the source of this link, right? But how much do you think it's really because of their personal relationship, and how much do you think of this as a transactional relationship between the UFC and Donald Trump's administration?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've tried to figure this one out. It's funny you bring this up, actually, because just last week I was actually rewatching a bunch of interviews that both Trump Jr. and Sr., mostly Senior, but Junior made the rounds as well, kind of discussing that when they were doing the Affliction media tours. So there was like an event at Trump Tower, there was like a red carpet event later on, and of course there was two events. And anyway, so I watched a bunch of them, and Trump never goes after UFC by name exactly, but I mean, he does a little bit, but like he definitely says stuff like, not we have the best fighters, which is okay, whatever. I mean, not true, but fine, you can say it. But then other stuff about like, we're going to treat them better, we're going to treat them right, and then even Don Jr. was hinting at how much that was like a gap in the market that they felt like they could fill. Now, obviously, it ended up being just a bunch of nonsense. But I guess the point I would make is like you're hinting at something that I think is quite there, which is there was some kind of early transactional relationship that was very minimal, and there may have been a divergence of interest at some point, and then they kind of came back together. It wasn't like people make it out to be like the first shows after the Zuffa purchase were at the Trump facilities, and everything just bloomed from that day forward. And the timeline doesn't seem to match that exactly. And in fact, you may have seen it. I think you were in it, as a matter of fact. The Bobby Rozic American Promoter documentary series.
Yeah,
have you seen it?
I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but I've seen portions. You
saw like the 1 hour or 1.5 hour like sizzle compilation.
Well, I didn't get a chance to see the whole thing. I saw not that long. I saw like a 10-minute version. Okay, or something.
So he did a screening here in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I went to it. And again, it's like a multi-part series. But the reason I bring it up is the condensed version that he had an old interview with Dana White in it. And he refers to like a bunch of competitors in the interview as well. And he throws Trump in there, kind of like dismissing all these guys as irrelevant and don't know what they're doing. So like this idea that like from 2001 on, it's all this cohesive thing just doesn't really add up there just has to be a great degree of transactionalism. I also do just think, though, that Dana White seems to have personally changed. Ari Emanuel found it useful. There was a bunch of it kind of coinciding together where now I do think that it's, obviously massively transactional, but they do seem to be simpatico beyond that as well.
Well, I guess the follow-up to that is, how much do you think this was by design and how much by accident? We know Stephen Chung became the White House communicator right from the UFC. And people are not aware he was a UFC media relations guy, left in 2016 when Endeavor came in and went right to work for Trump. administration. So there's a strong connection. And then there's Macon Delarim was a UFC lobbyist, went to be the first head of the antitrust division at the FTC under Trump or under the DOJ. I'm sorry. So there's been kind of a intertwining of some of the personnel, but how much do you think of this was by design in the sense that they intentionally said we are going to become a right-wing sports property, and how much do you think it was accidental as over time they saw more and more opportunities appear?
I think it's important to say I don't think they necessarily see themselves as a right-wing property, and in fact, this isn't a very important part to make. You alluded to the blowback that I've received on two different occasions. One was I was on the Mighty Mouse podcast, and I just sort of said, like, one of the things that's been a turnoff for me has been some of the right-wing turn of the sport, not just UFC, but like the sport kind of in general, because it's not just them, to be clear. And that generated enormous discontent among a big portion of certainly the Twitter fan base anyway. And then more recently, I gave this. The class at the University of Maryland asked me to give a lecture. It wasn't like I posted up there. It was like, listen to me with a megaphone. They asked me to go, but in any event, I think most people didn't even watch the interview. They didn't care but it was just about establishing that connection, and it yielded this very, very negative result. One of the things you have to realize is part of the people who are opposing what I'm saying, they don't even agree with each other. I mean, so for example, some you'll see them say there is no connection, or there's very little one, you're overstating it. And then other ones say, well, the connection is obvious. And then other ones play some kind of middle ground in between. But this idea that like everybody unanimously agrees that it's true, I've seen some people float that more recently. If that's the case, that's a brand new development, because that has not been traditionally how this has gone. I bring this up to say part of the reason, and actually one of the points I make in the speech, is that there's a self-identification issue going on where, like, for example, Joe Rogan does this bit where he says, various interviewers have asked him, aren't you anti-woke? You're creating this mothership comedy club in Austin, Texas. Isn't this an anti-woke comedy club? And he's very explicit. It's happened now in a number of interviews where he'll say, no. We're not anti-woke. We're just normal. We're a return to normalcy. And you've seen Dana White kind of echo some of this. And I don't think he's some kind of clone for Matt Walsh, but I also think that there's this kind of identification problem that they don't see it necessarily under those terms that we might see it that way. But the point that I have been making, and the point that I make in the speech and in other places as well, is that while I do not think that Dana White and, pick who you ever you want, Tucker Carlson, Matt Walsh, whoever, I don't think that they share similar ideas about the world. But what I do think is they were extremely arguably the most important mainstream entity in rehabilitating Trump following January 6th. And more importantly, that they are responsible for helping to return to power a political project. And that might come with things that they say after the fact that, well, we're like this, we're not like that. But to me, it's irrelevant. If you marshal your forces at an incredibly pivotal time to yield a political end, it's very difficult to then disassociate from those things after the fact. So I think that, and we'll see if to what extent they even try at any point. But I hope this answers the question, namely that I don't think that they see it that way. I think that they see it largely on transactional or simpatico terms, and they don't quite identify the same kind of partisan identity that you or I might.
Yeah, one thing I think a lot of fans are not aware of now, was it by design or by accident? I think a lot of it was by accident as we moved through the process of the election cycle, 2016, and what the way politics have changed since then. But I don't think a lot of fans are aware of that. I've spoken to members of UFC's sales staff and stuff. Is when Endeavor came in, they made an intentional decision to go after what they viewed as right-wing conservative sponsorship. Specifically because there was a lot of owners of companies that were turned off by the NFL, other sports leagues, because they viewed them as woke, bending the knee and not standing for the national anthem. And Dana White appearing at Donald Trump's election during his campaign, speaking at the convention, I should say, that opened a lot of eyes, and it brought, they were willing to come to the UFC and spend more for B, C tier sponsorship. And they viewed this as like, we can get this lesser tier sponsorship instead of going for the top tier sponsorship, but at a higher rate because they want to work with us. And I think So when people say the UFC is not right wing, it's like, well, they obviously made an intentional decision to go after this market. And I think they've only embraced it more over time. The market now, I think they're also now trying to maybe distance themselves, considering the popularity of Trump has collapsed. But that's part of it. The other thing I think might explain some of it, and I guess how much do you think this explains it? How much is there a crossover in the fan base that Dana White and Donald Trump appeal to? Because both are kind of authoritarian figures. You know, some people might protest my use of that for our president, but I think it's pretty obvious he has a very authoritarian traits. They're authoritarian figures who dictate who gets fired. You know, that Trump built his whole brand on that. Dana White dictates all the terms, has complete control of the company, at least in the image. And so how much of that overlap between MAGA and UFC that type of fans, not all fans, obviously not all fans, but that appeals to certain fans that just like that aesthetics of a figurehead riding shotgun over everything?
I think that it's a real part of the fan base, but even I would not say I think it'd be wrong to argue that that is. I think that the number of folks who you could say fit that description, the kind of Venn diagram you're talking about there, are real, but probably somewhat limited. You know, for example, like if you look, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, but it's worth just saying the recent polling, and there's some YouGov polling and some other places as well about the popularity of Donald Trump, which you just alluded to, really collapsing in general, but especially with young men. And so, you know, I think that there's a lot of young men within this kind of, you know, Rogan sphere, manosphere, what do you want to call it, MMA sphere or sport or the kind of adjacent world. The streaming world is also to a degree somewhat adjacent to that. I think all of these guys probably lean right in some kind of way, some more aggressively than others, certainly. You know, like the amount of anti-Semitism, and it's also just a real Twitter problem. It's not in any way exclusive to MMA, but it's also, you see it there too, is quite real. But the point I'm trying to make is a lot of them feel burned. A lot of them feel burned. It is very, very real, and that should be noted. And I think a lot of guys who went along for the ride were not the kind of guys who wore a Trump hat everywhere that they necessarily went. So if you're talking about like online populations, those are the ones to me where you get the most amount of partisanship. I think the average kind of person, the rank and file who goes to the events, there might have been pitched fevers where, you know, I'm sure you recall this. I forget which show it was, but one of the ones in Canada, and this is prior to the election, and in Canada, they're chanting, "Let's go, Brandon." It's just, you know, this is what I mean when it's like your critics come after you for saying, I think it's a right-wing sport when the Canadians are saying, "Let's go, Brandon." It's like, you know, this is not super ambiguous to anyone with a mammalian brain. But anyway, that's kind of where I come down on it. I think that it's real, especially the online version. I would be a little hesitant to say it's domineering as like a driving force throughout the entirety of the male fan base.
Okay, so it's a small, maybe there's some overlap, but it's a small segment of the Venn diagram that we're not.
I do think that the online ones have like an outsized role in how we perceive it. I do think it's worth saying that because they're so vocal, and it's, you know,
especially for me. I mean, that's online's. In real world, I don't talk to people that actually like this shit. So very, very few people I know in the real world actually watch this stuff. So
yeah, I mean, I'm still around.
Online's basically it for me.
I'm still around some MMA fans, and you know, again, it's just, you know, here's what I can tell. I have some people that are really close to me, as a matter of fact, are pretty conservative, and I kind of use them as a proxy for like how things are being perceived. And dude, there's dissension in the ranks. I do want to say one thing though. UFC fans won't really turn on Dana until the product really sours, and I know we've experienced some of that. And that's the thing that's got them undone. It's really not any political direction he's taken. Some are tolerant of it, others more accepting. But the real breaking point with fans has been, product performance.
Yep. Now let's move on to some other subjects of the UFC, and one is we're going to talk about the antitrust case, but I guess instead of the case itself, let's talk about, are you surprised at how little attention the Lee case and its settlement got, or how little attention the current cases are getting in the MMA industry sphere?
That's a loaded question, John.
Well, I don't know.
Am I surprised? Yeah. No. That's different than saying disheartened. That's different than saying, concerned, honestly, in certain ways. But not surprised, unfortunately. And I know that there's like this archetype of online man who's never surprised by anything. And I'm really not trying to do that. I want to make a clear argument in favor of why I'm saying I was not surprised, which is that the way in which content works in online spaces, this is true for websites, but websites are now really also just at the mercy of what social media does or how it drives trends or traffic and whatnot. The point I'm trying to make is, they have to make a decision each day about, there's 24 hours in a day, you're going to work 8 of them. I'm just making an example. What kind of content are you going to focus on in that amount of time that's going to actually drive a return such that you can sell ads against it or other forms of monetization schemes, right? And not including subscriptions, because you and I might do that on our Substacks or whatever, but in general, it's not a big way to get it. It's sort of a niche thing. And if you're looking at a business model where that is the driving force behind editorial decisions, it would make sense to me that they would not focus on the trial. I mean, the disheartening point, and I think it's one that you're probably keenly aware of, which is that, right, but what are we doing if we're judging it on like the value of news as it pertains to how big this could be for the industry? And on that account, I mean, it's a crime that it hasn't been covered as much. It's just, more people are like bothered by this stuff, and I guess I'm kind of not over it's not the right word, but this feeling of like, like, how did we not rise to this moment? I kind of got that burned out of me a while ago, and I'm like far on the other end now of being like, this is why, like, I'm being serious. This is why like Substacks or any kind of alternative model for funding news is so critical, because the existing mechanisms that drive mainstream corporate news, it's never going to go any other way. It's just hopeless to think otherwise.
Well, to continue on the antitrust front, I'm going to go address some of we're going to talk a little bit about the media in a bit, but is it concerning to you, considering the market power the UFC has, is it concerning to you that how few people, it seems, that follow MMA seem to understand how or why the UFC has market power? I mean, I should just be more specific. Does it raise questions about whether the public can recognize like market power, or even not forget the UFC, even generally the public at large? It seems you have Tim Wu on it. It seems
yes,
the concept that they are, it's alien or it's completely opaque. The concept of a monopoly and market power, and how they just cannot grasp how it impacts them.
It's okay. I am so glad you asked this.
Look at that. I asked a good question. Look at that.
Okay. Well, the reason why it's important is because you'll recall I did mention this to Tim Wu. By the way, who's the cat? You can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, that's Isla. She muted me. Look at that. That's Isla. I'm like, Brian is not the only one that gets a cat interrupting the show.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
I'm always talking to white dudes with cats.
Yeah, well, it's my girl I used to date. She passed away, but she left me the cat. Now I'm stuck with this. It's an abusive relationship. She runs everything. Okay. If anybody watches the podcast, they will know this cat. Podcast. Okay. This cat fucking dictates.
I listen to your podcast. I don't watch, so I'm seeing it now for the first time. Okay. Yeah. I actually asked Lena Khan this question too, and she did not agree with me, because I was kind of wondering the same thing. And I was wondering to myself, I was like, okay, why did she not agree? What did I miss? And then I kind of thought about it, and here's what I came to, and maybe you will agree, maybe you'll disagree, John, I don't know. But one of the things I was thinking about was like, if you're dealing with, decayed service, let's say, for example, in the healthcare realm, because of some kind of market concentration at some point of the care process, and you feel that, you know you're getting ripped off there. Like you know that. You know when, especially if it's one of those things where like private equity takes over and then there's like this gradual decline. You can feel that, and that absolutely people can recognize monopoly in those cases. It becomes more interesting when we're talking about something where they have a fan attachment to an entertainment product. And I feel like they have a very difficult time through that prism of grasping the ways in which that experience is still also being manipulated by those same other kinds of forces that they would recognize as destructive and potentially even malignant in a separate context. It just becomes very difficult for them to recognize this. I've been pulling my hair out about this because we've had cases where, I'm trying to talk to, I'm sure you feel the same, where I'm trying to talk to people about like what the people will come to me, hey, why is the UFC problem like this? And I'll try and say this to them, and I can see it's not really like they don't necessarily disagree, but it doesn't seem like a satisfactory answer. They want to go to it's Hunter Campbell's fault. They want to go to it's the Paramount streaming deal fault. And again, there's probably a variety of factors here that are working in concert to make this kind of condition. But it just kind of reminds me of like, oh, you're trying to find some kind of more accessible answer that's like visibly in your orbit rather than these kind of market conditions that they see as maybe onerous, but just, kind of part of the deal. Whereas what we're trying to tell them is this is all a function of choice. This is all manipulated. This is not how things are. This is how we have built them. And those choices, those building choices, come with consequences. That to me is a very different argument. Also, I will say this, I didn't grow up necessarily with influence about the dangers of monopoly. I mean, I knew about it in an abstract sense through, 19th century legislation and, history classes and whatnot, but I didn't really understand just how powerful they are in our lives. And I think in general, unless you really kind of, you have done the work of spending time reading about monopoly, and the more you do it, you're like, you just can't unsee it. I think a lot of people haven't got to the point where they've had that transformation.
The other thing, and I wonder if this is it too, is that in the case of the UFC it being a monopsony, or in other industries where it's a monopsony affecting the workers, it often's ignored. We become a nation of consumers, right? And we are no longer, I mean, that's the argument. We're now a nation of consumers worried much more about the price of goods than we are about labor, the wages. And so things like Amazon, which arguably has a monopoly on at least various aspects of it, is ignored. Why? People are not concerned that maybe the workers there are paid bad or that the vendors are mistreated because they have a monopoly. Why? Because we get cheap products delivered to our door instantaneously. And for the UFC, it's somewhat the same. We're not concerned that they may be driving other companies out of business, or they're dictating unfair terms to sponsors, or most importantly, paying fighters a small fraction of the revenue, as long as they're delivering a product to the consumer that they're satisfied with, because the consumer is the largest body, the most important part of at least ever since we transformed our antitrust law into consumer welfare, they're the most important constituent that has to be made happy.
I would have two, I think, responses to that, or add on, if I may. I years ago, I listened to a podcast from an animal activist, and the interviewer was asking them about some of their methods. Because as you know, like, for example, you'll see not so much animal activists, but like climate activists, they'll throw a tomato soup on a painting or whatever, and people are repulsed by this. And it wasn't about that, obviously, the particular incident, but about showing photos of like animals being abused and how like troubling that could be. Like, why did you do that? Anyway, but one of the things that they say, this guy who's been he'd been doing it for 25, 30 years, and one thing he kind of realized, like, this was at a time when, remember when like they were trying to make these like plant burgers you could get at Burger King and stuff like that.
I tried eating them for a while. So
yeah, I tried them. I mean, again, they weren't like the healthiest choice, but they tasted all right. Anyway, well, one of the points that he makes is that the reason they went that route was because they realized that after decades of trying otherwise, that as long as Americans felt like the best deal for them to feed their families was cheap meat, they were always going to pick cheap meat. They were never, they would even say, we sympathize with these animals. We're not for animal abuse. We're just going to make a calculated decision with the pocketbook once it arrives at us. I think like that is a very powerful thing to consider when thinking about customer and consumer preferences and what's going to get them out of it. I had another one. I forgot what it was, but we can go with that one. I think it's sort of the main point that I want to go with.
That's good enough. We'll edit out the part that you forgot. That's fine.
Yeah,
no.
Sorry.
That's all right. Okay, now let's go on to the other big story in MMA right now, the Ali Act. So speaking of concerns, we said about people not knowing about market power. Do you think the stakeholders in boxing, do you think they've caught on to the threat?
I remember.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, don't make sure I don't forget my question. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm so sorry. It's actually, you know what? It might be dovetailing with yours. Why don't you ask your question now that I remember it, and then we'll see if it works together.
Okay, this might be fortuitous. The boxing stakeholders, do you think they've caught on yet to the threat that Zuffa Boxing could potentially pose for them?
No. They well, maybe Eddie Hearn. I think Eddie seems to have a little bit more sense about some of this stuff. I don't know what he intends to do about it. That's a separate question, but you're kind of asking about awareness. My answer that I was going to give actually dovetails with this perfectly. I do think an underrated factor, and this is not the biggest deal, but I think it's worth considering, is that boxing was way too nonchalant about letting itself get portrayed as a metaphor for sports disaster. The people who, and you can see that now because like who inside boxing really takes up the idea that like, okay, we've got problems, but like there's a lot working right here that you should feel good about. Like, for example, a case of a mandatory who got the mandatory title shot and it was awarded on time and then he wins the title. Like that's the system working. Or why do boxers make more than MMA fighters? It doesn't just fall from the sky. There's a mechanism to explain this. I think they have been very, very slow to ever do that, or not doing it at all. And we know the reasons why. They might have felt like, the system is broken in certain ways, or they didn't like a sanctioning body. And there's been problems with, any number of things about the way boxing has gone. And they might have even indulged a little bit in like the boxing's broken. It is kind of what it is. We're just going to leave it alone. I think that honestly helps set the groundwork for a lot of the current conditions, because what they're doing is they're pointing reputationally to what the UFC is doing. Hey, our guys, I was at those hearings. You watched them. Our guys, number 4 fights number 5, and number 2 fights number 3. That's how it goes. When in fact we know that's not the case at all. And then similarly saying in boxing's the opposite of that, constantly pitching them as the avatar of dysfunction. And again, part of that is deserved because they have been dysfunctional in so many ways. So the other sort of corollary to the argument here is that the stakeholders didn't do a good enough job of just kind of protecting their own architecture, which is kind of a separate thing we can get to. But I just mean it's to say the through line for me is that they have been caught. No one has a reflex to protect the common good in boxing. People, they're late to it. They don't know whose job it is. They don't have any kind of cohesive plan. There's not, like, it just seems so disjointed, which perhaps is a metaphor for the state of the current industry more generally. But you and I know that when like the UFC and now TKO, whenever they do something, it's everything is fastball. Everything is hardball. Everything is to the max. The plan is to take control. They don't have any other reflex or instinct. That's just what they do. And I think people are looking at the boxing industry and saying, well, it's different. We don't have to have the same pressures. But the change to the Ali Act completely undercuts that argument in every way. And I don't think they understand the kind of competitor that they're up against.
Well, in defense of the corrupt image of boxing, it did give us tons of awesome movies, unlike other sports. So it's really.
What's funny? I was asking. You're the movie guy, right? Yeah. We were talking about this on MK today. Okay, obviously one side is way longer than the other one, but like, I feel like it's easier to make a good boxing movie than it is easier to make a good MMA movie, and I'm really not entirely sure why.
Well, I think it's pretty simple, is because of the acronym UFC, because it has to be about the UFC because they're the big leagues. But I don't think the UFC is going to let you make a movie about an old vet that's at the end of his rope and like realizing he has nothing saved for him. It's got to be like The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke or something. It's got to be something along those lines. And if you can't tell that story, because every great boxing story, the setup, the harder they fall, Fat City, Raging Bull, it's all about that what they got left with was not great for their participation in boxing, the damage and stuff they suffered. No one's going to make a movie about a guy exiting MMA, specifically the UFC, because that's only anybody cares about. Otherwise, no one's going to assume this is about major MMA. No one exiting with long-term damage and no money. So
Yeah,
everybody's got to be kind of a feel good. Now, the greatest MMA movie ever made, of course, was the one I worked on called No Rules, which had the great line, "This is a no rule fight, no hitting in the groin or biting." So that was with Gary Busey, Frank Shamrock, Randy
Is this
Couture.
really good, or are you doing a bit?
This is it's the worst movie ever made.
Yeah. Okay.
Worst, but the only good thing about it, it got me to tune into MMA because I hated MMA in the 90s when I first saw it. In 2000, when Frank Shamrock, when Randy came back and fought Chuck Liddell, that's what got me back into MMA. So, so that's I only owe it for that. Other than that, it is trash, but it's worth seeing because it has every MMA cliche, affliction T-shirts everywhere, giant tires on your truck, douchebags everywhere. That's the movie.
Hell yeah.
So
hell yeah, I gotta see it now. Now you sold it to me.
You gotta see it with Gary Busey talking, fucking being the coach, and Tom Sizemore's, and I don't know, it's fucking amazing.
All right.
But to get off that movie, we could talk about that movie for a while. But to get off that and get back onto boxing, the other thing about boxing kind of surprised me. I've been talking to a lot of people in the industry. I mean, I guess to give it away, I've been also talking to people. Staff members in Congress and Senate and the House that have contacted me to ask questions. But with the boxing people, I've been somewhat surprised at how little they understood what the Ali Act did, even when it's not perfect. It's like you have to go back to the old timers that were around when it was passed. You know, the Kurt Emhoffs, the Pat Englishes, the Lou DiBellas, that understood kind of what it did, because the other ones, the current people that cover it, that are in it, they seem completely surprised about what could possibly happen if some of those protections are removed.
They've been on autopilot for quite a long time. I think it's just kind of the way that it goes. And, you know, it's interesting, right? Like the TKO Ali Act, you know, one thing that I think is obviously, you know, there will probably be more than one UBO, but this is obviously legislation that was written, you know, by lobbyists for one firm, right? That's my belief, and I think the evidence speaks to that pretty strongly. And you go back and you look around at the time of the Ali Act, you know, when it was passed, and what McCain and Pat English and some of the other people were trying to do, and the people who were around and wrote that, they were actually, like, again, to the extent that they saw.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!